Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fanfiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Think I can forgive Imoku asking for a shake in exchange for what he gave us. I made it extra sugary. Tomura was torn between wanting to go to demand answers from Izuku and gloating over overhaul. Still, it wasn't that long before Toga came back. Apparently they'd cut the usual dinner short. I made sure Toga had seen Imoku eat a lot. She rolled her eyes and reminded me that she had been feeding her baby Izuku for the last 2 years. The name she used did not go unnoticed, but at least she had the sense to refer to Izuku only when she was alone with us. Finding out how she knows that name is something Overhaul can tell us. Himiko relayed some details and she even looked ashamed that she had been, at least partially, to blame for Imoku being found by Overhaul. She said something about owing him a favor. She positively glowed at the thought. I knew she liked older men, but I wonder what she'd think if she knew Izuku was her own age. Tomura waved her explanation off. He was too pleased with having Overhaul. I'm not sure if he realizes that Izuku used one of the quirk-destroying bullets we had given him. Maybe Tomura has noticed it and believes the payoff is worth the price. That would be like him. He's used to using rare items in games for an appropriate reward. Quirkless Overhaul is a very good reward. I had thought that Izuku was going to copy the bullets. I am not sure what I feel about him having one stashed at his supposed mother's apartment. It makes me wonder where the other bullet is. I cannot argue the fact that it was used for a good purpose. Tomura is currently wondering what to do with Overhaul. Personally, I believe that making him into a Numu would be interesting, though that would be far easier with Sensei. Forcing extra quirks into a person with one drives them insane, though to be fair, at least some of the men used as the base for each Numu have had a loose grip on sanity to begin with. The number of quirks required to drive a person insane depends on their mental strength and how closely related their quirk is to the one being forced into them. Someone with a strength augmentation quirk is likely to be able to withstand a shock absorption quirk but will not be able to handle any emitter-type quirks. Izuku was proof that a quirkless person can accept at least 2 quirks. Sensei was very clear that Izuku has 2 quirks, though I am still not sure what the second one is. I will have to ask Himiko if she knows. I suspect she doesn't. Tobe is not stupid, so she will be aware that Izuku has 2 quirks, but she will not know the details of the second. Tomura doesn't care. But what I wonder is how someone who has had their quirk removed would handle the process of becoming a Numu. Would they count as quirkless? Or would their body, like their mind, still remember their previous quirk? I probably won't find out. It is a passing interest. Of more interest than the mess Tomura will make of Overhaul is what is happening in the hero world. The HPSB finally issued their psychological assessment to the heroes of Japan. The fallout has been glorious. So many failures. Villains have always known the truth, so many of the public ignore. Heroes are in the gig for money, fame, and glory. There are very few who enter the industry with the desire to truly help people. I am not so naive as to believe that the HPBS assessment focused on that. For the younger ones, those in training, there will be some assessment of their desire. For the elder heroes, those with a proven record, then the test will have been geared to their mental stability. It is laughable. I almost feel pity for the HPBS, but it is a fact that all heroes have their quirks, their own oddities. It is passed off as what is needed to be successful. Villains have them as well. Even the League twice is full of them. Toga as well, with her desire to cut up any boy her age. It is a ritual for many, but villains do not have to prove their mental stability. Our only qualifications are results. The first heroes to fail and were sensible about it, retired. The public still thinks rather highly of them. For the others, the HPBS was forced to announce their results, and things went downhill for them. None of them suffered as badly as Endeavor, but it was another blow to an industry already reeling. The public has almost had enough of heroes. They are tired of the scandal. They want something more, something better. They are not going to get it, of course, but the public always desires the unobtainable. And it suits us. In an effort to strengthen belief in the current order, the HPBS had All Might take the assessment. It came as a surprise to none that he passed it. The results were well publicized, but the public has not forgotten All Might's forced retirement. It still saddens me to know that Sensei is incarcerated, but I must remind myself that it was our victory. A leader for a leader, and Sensei was far more prepared for his defeat than All Might was. I will grant that revealing All Might's assessment results calmed some of the public, but those were the people. Who would have calmed anyway? In any society there are those who do not care, so long as their creature comforts are not disturbed. As much as I hate heroes, those people are worse. I can respect someone with an opinion, and the conviction to fight for it, even if that conviction is the desire for fame. But those who will sell themselves out, I do not like them. But they are not the problem. With Overhaul in good hands, hey, I'm sure the focus will now turn to Hawks. The hero passed his assessment. I'm sure the HPBS breathed a collective sigh of relief about that, but they know the situation is still very fragile. But that's okay, the league has a sledgehammer of op Hawks. Dobby greeted the number one hero as he moved from the shadows. It was surprisingly easy to keep the pleased smile on his face. Hawks moved further into the abandoned building. Dobby was pleased to see that the number one pro hero wasn't suspicious, but then they had been meeting for quite some time. And since they couldn't exactly go to a cafe for a cup of coffee, their meeting points had been a series of abandoned buildings and warehouses. Hawks would have liked some isolated area, but Dobby had pointed out early in their relationship that isolated areas were visible to security cameras, and it didn't matter how poor the area was, there was always one around. A building or a warehouse had a roof to help hide them from prying eyes. The warehouse today was solid. Concrete pillars held everything up, and Dobby knew, because he'd had to scout it out, that there was at least 5 floors above them. Hawks was strong but did not possess a strength enhancement quirk. He might be able to cut through them, but the League had thought of that. Tomura was more than aware of how important this battle was. They could not afford to have Hawks escape. What is that? The hero demanded, looking behind Dobby. That's my Numu, Dobby replied nonchalantly. Your Numu? Dobby huffed. You know we retrieved them. You were quite upset about it, he added, reminding the hero how annoyed he had been. At the time, Dobby had thought it was because Hawks wanted to join in, but now he knew it was because Hawks wanted to stop it. I can't exactly leave it with the others, because it only obeys me. He watched as Hawks moved forward slightly to get a better look at it. The chainsaw one, Dobby explained, knowing that as the number one hero would be familiar with the various designs. They had the original Numu, 2 of the Numu used in Hosu, the chainsaw Numu in high-end. All the others under development were considered too unfinished to use. It was a disappointment, since Hawks would have some understanding of their abilities. But understanding abilities wasn't countering them, and given that the original Numu had been designed to take out All Might, the League was confident. The flying Numu would have problems moving around in this setting, but it was still remarkably quick. It was stationed on the roof of the building and would act if Hawks made to escape. It's bigger than I thought, Hawks said, moving slightly closer. The hero was naturally wary and kept a bit of distance. Dobby was used to that, and he shrugged at the statement. The Numu just was. I think you are going to be happy today, Dobby told the number one hero. Oh? The fire villain gestured to the side. Tomura wants to meet you, he said before the familiar swirl of Kurogiri's warp gate appeared. There was a flash of surprise on the man's face before Dobby saw him settle. I've wanted to meet him as well, Hawks replied as Tomura emerged. Kurogiri reformed behind him. Dabi knew the warp villain had transported the other members of the League as well as the Numas. Tomura was dressed formally. That meant the full set of disembodied hands were gripping him. He still wore a simple black pullover, black pants with his red shoes. Dabi could see his eyes peering out from between the fingers of the hand covering his face. The two of them faced off against each other. Dabi has been telling me some interesting news, Tomura announced. Hawks nodded. Dabi could see that the hero was slightly surprised. He hadn't expected this confrontation today, despite his requests. Tomura lifted one hand, scratching at his neck. Of course, the question everyone wants to know is why. I didn't go through UA, so I didn't get indoctrinated like the rest of the good little heroes, Hawk said. I've seen the damage heroes are doing. All Might was too powerful. He was too much of a symbol, and now that he's gone, everything collapses. Hawk snorted. I used to admire him, but the less said the better. Dabi watched the speech. Now that he knew the hero was planning on betraying them, the man's words took on a different meaning. He could hear the slight note of uncertainty, the surprise. Ah, but this one is still a hero, Tomura replied, in that whiny tone of voice he thankfully didn't use so often now. It made him seem like a spoiled toddler. Dabi could appreciate that it was for effect and was once again surprised at how controlled the League's leader could be when he wanted. The tone affected Hawks. Dabi could see the way the hero cringed. It was subtle, but Tomura could get under anyone's skin. Yes, Tomura Shigaraki, he is, Hirojiri replied. The warp villain had almost infinite patience when dealing with Tomura, but Dabi supposed the mist villain had been doing it for longer than any of them. Except Imoku. And he plans on remaining a hero, Tomura continued. No, I don't. Hawks objected. It even sounded truthful. The Hero Public Safety Bureau plans indicate that he will, Hirojiri replied. Hawks reacted instantly. He ripped two long feathers from his wings and charged towards Tomura almost too fast to be seen. Except, it wasn't the League taken by surprise. The original Numu dropped through a portal, and behind Hawks, at the door, High End moved to cover the entrance. Tomura didn't even move when Hawks slashed at the Numu. It reacted. Hawks was fast, but the Numu had been created to take out a hero who was far strong and faster than Hawks. During All Might's reign, the winged hero had been worthy of the title number 3 hero, but All Might embodied the huge gap between the number 1 hero and the rest. Not all heroes were equal. Even so, Hawks managed to avoid the Numu's punch. He flared his wings, sending a spray of features into the ground. Others flew around. Dabi was waiting for that. He sent a gout of fire to the ground, burning them. Hawks glanced at him for a moment. The hero saw everything he needed in that single look. Dabi's expression was hard and unforgiving. The friendship they might have formed was dead. The hero backed away as the Numu advanced. He was sensible enough to realize he was in a very bad situation. His assessment didn't get any better when he glanced behind to see the other Numu blocking the door. And Hirojiri opened another warp gate, bringing in the last one. This was one that had been arrested in Hosu. Its 4 eyes glared balefully at the hero. High End, Tomura called the name. It was enough of an order. High End wanted to fight. 4A. Numu, he actually had feelings. The others didn't, and the bird-like Numu, the original Numu, moved back to stand with Tomura, guarding him. Master, the Numu acknowledged and charged. Hawks tried to fly out of the way, but space was limited. The building was large, but the ceiling was not high and the Numu too fast. This one had been designed differently. It was still ridiculously strong and fast. Dabi had wondered once which might win in a battle between them. Tomura had confidently asserted that High End would take out all the other Numu except for the original. Even the League's leader wasn't sure which would win then. Not that the Numus would ever get a chance to fight each other. There were enough heroes to go around. Hawks slashed at high end with the 2 feathers he had originally pulled from his wings. They were long feathers, almost like swords. His wings were looking shabby, but Dabi knew that they were still functional. The Numu didn't even bother to dodge the cuts. Blood slashed onto the concrete floor, but the wounds healed and high end took a swing at Hawks. The hero jumped back quickly but hadn't anticipated the speed of the attack. High end jumped forward and Dabi saw something on its shoulders that pushed it faster. Jets, he realized, and equally realized that being this close was not a good position to be in. He was thankful his Numu would cover him. The layout now made sense. While there were other members of the league present, they were on the other floors, positioned there to attempt to slow down Hawks if he tried to go that way. Those on this floor were all covered by a Numu. It would not be a usual tactic for a hero, but Hawks could have tried to take any of them hostage. Not that it would have worked. Tomura didn't care about them. Not even Kurogyri, though Dabi felt that Tomura would at least regret losing the warp villain. The rest of them, not so much. But it didn't appear as if any of them would be lost today. Hawks was backing away from high end. He still had both feather swords gripped tight, but there was a dark mark forming on the side of his face, and Dabi could see that he was favoring his left side. Weak, high end droned before leaping for the hero. Hawks tried to slow the Numu down with a barrage of feathers. They simply lodged in the Numu's flesh, not hindering it in the slightest. The hit it delivered impacted the hero as high end didn't worry about getting cut from the blades. Hawks flew into one of the walls, leaving an impressive crater. Most would be finished from that, but Hawks knew he had to get away. His wings were almost down to the bone, and Dabi could see the way that he was struggling. Blood dripped from Hawks' mouth, but he managed to pull the last few feathers out and fling them. Dabi didn't understand the motion until his Numu moved. As did Tomura's. From his angle, Dabi could see the way the original Numu was crouched in front of Tomura, a feather stuck into its chest. It was not the move he expected from Hawks, but it made brutal, logical sense. It was too late. Though. High end slammed into the hero and Dabi watched as the smaller body shook with the force of the hits. Hawks was going to die, which wasn't really an issue but seemed too merciful from Tomura. Stop. Dabi snorted as the order echoed his thoughts. It's weak, high end complained. Yes, Tomura agreed, moving forward. The original Numu moved with him. Is there something stronger? High end demanded. There will be, Tomura told the Numu. Dabi wondered who but realized it didn't matter. There might be someone stronger out there. The hero ranking was based on many things, not just strength, so it was possible that one of the up-and-coming heroes was stronger than they seemed. He doubted it. But maybe his little brother? Who knew? That was a problem for another day. Tomura looked down at the now unconscious and broken hero. Somehow, Hawks had managed to keep his 2 sword feathers. Tomura touched one, disintegrating it almost instantly, but then he carefully picked up the other. His little finger ostentatiously raised. A trophy. Kurogyri, Tomura ordered, though Dabi could tell he was pleased. The warp villain nodded and opened warp gates. Dabi looked upwards, knowing that Kurogyri would be opening gates for the others who hadn't had to fight. Tomura calmly walked through the gate, followed by the original Numu, and then High End, who was dragging Hawks by one crushed leg. It was a good thing the hero was unconscious or the pain would be indescribable. Dabi looked around. There wasn't that much damage, just a few feathers here and there, a bit of blood, and the impact point Hawks had made. Oh well. It's not like he would have told his sidekicks where he was. If the other heroes found this place, there wasn't much they could do. It was time to go home. Dabi paused at the thought before he smiled. It was correct. It was time to go home. He stepped through the gate, a thought, but as always surprised me, in an industry that is meant to be for public safety, how little safety there is for the heroes. Hawk's disappearance was noticed, and while I am aware that his sidekicks looked for me, there was very little effort made to search for him. I know this, because Imoku confirmed it. Of course, even if there had been a large public search, then it would have found nothing. Oh, they might have found the building, but they wouldn't have found Hawks. Not without finding us. And given the hero's condition, finding him was not the same as saving him. High End had not held back. The scientists involved in creating the other Numus double as doctors, but even they were hard-pressed to keep the hero alive. They did, but he would never recover properly. That suits the League. We do not need an attempted traitor. The heroes would argue that Hawks didn't actually betray us. He never got the chance. Technically that is true. But the League doesn't operate via technicalities. We operate via results, and there is no questioning. Tomura's results. He has changed. When Sensei was captured, Tomura was a child. He was selfish, and often he could not see reality. He is still selfish, but we all are to some extent, but now he sees reality, and when he doesn't like it, he knows how to change it so that it is more pleasing to him. Villains operate on results, and Tomura's have been good. There is no escaping that. The underworld recognizes it. And Imoku has capitalized on it. I don't think Tomura completely understands that yet. He has focused on what affects him, which has been enough, but the rest of the League have been seeing what Imoku is doing. Toga has been good. Only the core members of the League know Imoku is a part of the League. Tomura, myself, Dabi, Toga, Mustard, Twice, and Compress. Those who came in early. The newer members simply know Togo goes once a week to visit a contact. They do not know who he is. They sometimes ask Dabi how he arranged that interview. Those who think seriously about the incident do. Anyway, most people don't think about the logistics involved. But the message is out there. It began slowly, but it is accelerating. The world as we know it has almost fallen. Faith in heroes is at an all-time low, and Imoku has already planted the seeds of the future. So many villains just rage against the system. So many claim they want to change it, but they do not truly think about the transition, or what happens next. I am proud that the League has. The heroes will not appreciate it, but the League has managed so much. We are managing that transition, so that when they fall there will not be chaos. We are managing the change, never taking it too fast. They will never thank us. Tomura doesn't see it either. I doubt many will. The future will. The future will look back on these years, and those then will know how carefully everything was controlled, how much work it took to ensure everything came together. Sensei always said it took more practice, more work to make something seem effortless. It is Imoku who is doing that. Work. He is doing it well. No one suspects him. I'm sure there are those who suspect he is guilty of something. That's inevitable, given his positions in business and politics. But there is no one who suspects he is working for the League. That's what counts. The Hero Public Safety Bureau assessments continue. There have been more heroes failing, but most of the public have become tired of that. It makes sense. If the high-ranking heroes fail, then it stands to reason that those lower down the ranks will also fail. It is not news, though Imoku mentions it every now and then, gently hammering home the point, keeping the public aware. It is a subtle way of manipulating the environment. It keeps the public's mind open and ready for change. It makes the government aware of the need for change. And no one is any the wiser about Imoku's involvement. Overhaul knows, but Overhaul is in no position to talk. I think he is still alive, but I admit I haven't checked lately. If he is, then he's probably enjoying whatever Tomura is doing too. Hawks. The two of them are being imprisoned near the other. I hope they enjoy each other's company, though how much either can talk is in question. For the moment, the League is simply enjoying our success. We have not won yet, but it is just a matter of time. AFO Mirio sat quietly at the table while he waited. The room was plain but soundproofed. He could see cameras in each of the corners. It felt like he was a prisoner, but he knew the door was open. He could walk out at any time, he wouldn't. And those who had sent him here knew he wouldn't. The door opened. A middle-aged woman walked in. She was dressed in a simple suit and carried a clipboard. Mirio watched as she took the seat across the table. She laid the clipboard on the table, paper side down before looking up at him. Mirio closed his eyes at her expression, and for once he didn't see. Mirio mentally shook the image away. He knew what her expression meant. He'd been expecting this. "My name is Tsukiko Abusaki," she told him. "I work as a psychologist for the Hero Public Safety Bureau." Mirio Togata, he introduced himself. She nodded. She already knew that. "In the wake of the League of Villains attack on the Night Eye Agency, I administered your assessment, in accordance with the Heroes Must Be Heroes Bill, Section 27.35.1. Mirio nodded. He knew what that section said. The basic part of the bill said that all heroes or those working as sidekicks had to have yearly psychological assessments. It made sense. It kept them from becoming too stressed. It kept them from bottling their problems inside. It kept them from going insane. The section Tsukiko was referring to was further down. It required that in the wake of a traumatic incident, all involved be assessed to ensure that they had recovered, or were recovering from the incident. It was generous. It was mature and compassionate, and Mirio was sure it was a good thing. The assessments were designed to keep heroes, and those who worked with them, sane. The community, and the public needed that. But he knew what his assessment would say. Your results indicate that you were unduly affected by the incident. Follow-up assessments reveal that even with treatment you have remained stressed. Mirio was hard-pressed not to slam his hands on the table. Of course he remained stressed. How could he not? It was his fault that Sir Night-Eye had lost his quirk, had lost the ability to view the future. Sir told him it was a blessing, insisted even. Sir said it was better this way, that he accepted it, but Mirio could see the way he was tired and stressed, and in pain. And it was all his fault. As you are an active sidekick, due to subsection 27.35.3, you are required to take a leave of absence from hero work while you attend to your mental health. Mirio nodded. He knew this was coming. You can attend sessions with a HPBS-appointed psychologist, or you can nominate your own, Tsukiko continued. I will take your recommendation, Mirio said. He wasn't sure who else he could see, and one good thing had come about from some of the heroes being forced into retirements. Some of them were training, or already had training to be psychologists. Not everyone did the hero course. They understood the needs of a hero. They would understand when he spoke to them, and most of the former heroes, turned psychologists, worked for the HPSB because it was all so new. Mirio thought that in time they'd move on, branching out to start their own clinics. One of them, Amplifier, Mirio thought it was, had made the humorous connection, saying that working at the HPSB was the equivalent at working at a hero agency as a sidekick. You gained experience there before you went to start your own. So he'd feel better speaking with the HPSB psychologists. A civilian psychologist would do their best but just wouldn't understand. Tsukiko nodded, and flipped over the clipboard. She pulled a pen from her pocket, and after flipping over several pages, she made a note. I will send you a list of those who are available, she told him. Thank you. Do you need to make arrangements with your agency? Tsukiko asked. Mirio shook his head. Sir. Night-Eye and Centipeder already knew. They had both tried to reassure him, and told him to get better so that he could return to work. They would hold a place for him. Tsukiko looked at him. Mirio said nothing. He looked back. She sighed. How do you feel about this? She asked at length. How did he feel about it? He didn't hate the assessments. They were for his protection, after all. They were for the protection of everyone. He hated the League. And he hated that he hated himself for that. As a hero he wasn't meant to hate. But he did. He could feel the emotion burning in him. He wasn't sure how he could deal with it, unless he could face the League. But he couldn't face the League until he was better, and that required him to let go of his hate. How did he do that? UA had taught him a lot, but they had never covered that. Frustrated, Mirio admitted honestly. Sakiko gave him a pleased smile. I understand. It is not an unusual reaction, she told him. I know it seems like you won't get better, and that you will be banned from hero work forever, but that's not the case. With the help of the HPSB you will get better and you can return. And in the long run, it will be better for you, and for everyone. So, I would ask you to accept the frustration for the moment, and look to the future. Mirio nodded. This wasn't a therapy session, but an informative one. He took a deep breath and sighed. I'll try, he told her. He had no other choice. A thought things Kurogiri doesn't know. Inko Midoriya was a simple woman. Sure, she knew life wasn't perfect, but she had her son, they had enough to eat, and they loved each other. That was enough. She was content. Until the day Izuku never came home. At first she wasn't concerned. There had been a villain fight earlier in the day, and Izuku loved those. He was probably trying to get more information. And then there came news of another villain attack, one that All Might stopped. Knowing Izuku, he'd be on the fringes of that fight, watching intently. So she wasn't concerned and continued fixing dinner for them both. But then a half hour late turned into an hour, that turned into 2, and there was no notification from him. Sometimes some of the villain fights took out transport and Izuku had to walk, but he always told her. Except this time he didn't. Inko tried calling him. There was no answer. More worryingly, the phone didn't go to messages. She got a message telling her that the number had been cut off. She tried again. She texted him, and then she got onto her social media and contacted him. Inko had promised Izuku she wouldn't stalk him online, but knowing those accounts had made her feel happier. They hadn't been touched. They were still there, but Izuku hadn't logged in since that morning. Inko called Mitsuki, and was half in tears when she spoke to her old friend. After some shouting and explosions, Mitsuki told her that Katsuki hadn't seen Izuku since he left school. There was a note in Mitsuki's voice that Inko wouldn't recognize. Until later. Mitsuki was worried, but that was for Katsuki since he had nearly died. It was 9 p.m. when Inko called the police. The food she had prepared had gone cold on the table, but she didn't care. She was comforted when they sent over someone immediately. She put on a pot of tea and let the policeman in, and she thought everything would be okay. It wasn't. They took her statement, but Inko could see something in their eyes when she described her son. The moment they asked about his quirk and she was first to admit that he didn't have one, there was something there. The policeman remained professional, he took down everything she said, but Inko felt sick. She cleaned up that night and went to bed but didn't sleep. It didn't get any better the next day. After choking down a bit of toast, Inko walked to the station. She introduced herself at the front desk and was told to wait. The station moved around her, active despite the early time. She tried not to listen. She tried not to cry. She tried not to worry, but she could hear snippets of conversation around here. Worse than a gun dash, better than yesterday dash, multiple counts dash. It was not comforting. Eventually a detective came to see her. His introduced himself as Detective Tanima. He showed her to his desk, sat her down, gave her tea, and then started asking questions. Except they were the same questions she'd been asked last night. Inko forced herself to be calm. Crying here wasn't going to find Izuku. She pointed out that the questions were the same. Tanima looked at her. I'm sorry, ma'am, I know that. It is just routine protocol to confirm everything, he reassured her. It's not finding Izuku. Inko couldn't help but point out. It helped us establish due cause and the facts of the situation, he countered. It took Inko a moment to realize what he was saying. He thought Izuku had run away because of her. Rage briefly drowned the worry she was feeling. My son has not just run away, Inko said quietly. Her words were reinforced when everything on his desk rattled. Ma'am, please call down, Tanima said. Quickly. No one believes your son has run away, he added. It was not convincing. You do, Inko said pointedly. The detective sighed. Statistically, ma'am, when a child that's not what happened. Inko could no longer stay calm. She wailed, thick tears forming in her eyes and rolling down her face. Tanima seemed uncomfortable. He didn't run away, Inko cried. He wouldn't. She didn't see when another detective put their hand on Tanima's shoulder and took his place. Ma'am. Inko didn't recognize the change in voice. Ma'am, the new detective said more urgently. There was something in his voice that caused her to look. Inko blinked through her tears, recognizing that a new man was sitting there. Tanima stood uncertainly behind him. My name is Detective Naomasa, ma'am, the newcomer introduced himself. Inko nodded but didn't say anything. We will fill out the rest of those questions later, he said. For now, could you tell me if your son could have been involved with any of the incidents yesterday? Inko blinked. What type of question was that? And then she recalled the two incidents that had been reported yesterday. He would have watched, Inko said slowly. Izuku loves villain fights. He loves seeing the heroes. The new detective nodded and noted something down. And Izuku goes to Aldera Junior High? Inko nodded. Could you tell me if this is your son? Detective Naomasa asked, tapping on a tablet before handing it over to her. Inko peered at it. The footage was grainy and bad, but it showed Izuku. Her heart lightened just seeing it. He was walking into an underpass. He was okay though. He was in his uniform and something dropped onto him. She couldn't tell from the footage, but it looked gooey, almost like mochi, and she could see Izuku struggling with it. Her heart clenched. Had Izuku been involved in one of the attacks yesterday? She always worried that one day he'd get too close, that one day. Something blocked the camera, no, that was someone, but then they moved and she saw Izuku again. He was fine, though coughing. It took her a moment to recognize the other person in shot. Was that All Might? Inko felt her heart clench. What had happened? The pro-hero was smiling, and Izuku was following him before he leapt away. And Izuku vanished. What? Inko couldn't help the question. Detective Naomasa looked at her. Your son was involved in one of the incidents yesterday, specifically what is being referred to as the sludge villain, the man told her. He disappears there because he latched onto All Might, he added, nodding at the now frozen tablet image. 100 thoughts bombarded Inko. Where was Izuku? If he was with All Might, then why wasn't he fine? But then more words seeped into her consciousness. He'd latched on to All Might. Was he okay? Had he fallen? Had there been damage from the sludge villain? Was he in hospital right now? She didn't know. He was transported to a rooftop, where All Might let him off, Naomasa said with a small smile. Inko breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't remain. The next words would haunt her forever. And then, the trail goes cold. No. 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 This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Not to Izuku. There is unfortunately no footage from the roof, but there are sensors on the doorway. They detect when someone opens the door to the stairway to get down, Naomasa explained. Or to get up to the roof. Inko nodded. Her building had them as well. All buildings had them. They didn't record who went onto the roof, just that someone did. It was some sort of safety feature and the data had a lot of other uses. All data had uses. She didn't quite understand it, but there was a lot of things she didn't understand. It wasn't tripped, the detective said. It took her a moment to understand. What do you mean it wasn't tripped? Inko asked, attempting to remain polite. The sensor on the rooftop door was not tripped, he elaborated. And an examination of the CCTV cameras in that building and in the streets outside, from the time of the incident with the sludge villain to now, does not display. Your son. She stared at the detective, trying to work out what he said. So where is he? Inko asked. That is what we are trying to determine, ma'am, Naomasa told her. What did All Might say? The two detectives just stared at her. Inko knew what she looked like. She was short. She was dumpy and she cried too much. She came off as a weakling, and while all that might be true, when it came to Izuku she had a core of iron. She would not break. Naomasa seemed too surprised for words. You must have spoken to him, Inko said, telling the sense of panic she felt to come back later. We have, ma'am, the detective finally said. He confirmed that he rescued your son from the sludge villain and then left your son on the roof. Before he leapt off again, as part of the sludge villain had gotten away and he needed to subdue it. Inko correlated that against what she knew from the news. That made sense. There had been no report that the sludge villain had attacked anyone earlier in the day, just that it had attacked and had been subdued by All Might. The detective looked down to a tablet. At 1614 All Might initially subdued the sludge villain, and at 1628, it reappeared and was subsequently taken. Down again, he read the report to her. 14 minutes, Inko thought. 14 minutes in which Izuku disappeared. It was far too long. She looked at the detectives, focusing on the second one as he seemed much more reasonable. You have to find him, she implored Detective Naomasa. He's all I have, she added in a whisper. Ma'am, we will do everything we can. She nodded, hating the feeling of hopelessness she felt. It was a feeling that didn't go away. A day turned into 2. 2 days turned into a week. The week turned into more. Every day Inko tried to keep up her hope, but it was hard. Izuku just wasn't there. He never came home. He never messaged. His phone remained dead. His online accounts remained dead. Each week, Inko cleaned his room, careful not to disturb anything, and she changed the sheets. But there was a hollow feeling in her gut that just wouldn't go away. It had started the moment she realized Izuku was missing. It grew exponentially when the detectives told her they had exhausted every lead. It was lying in her stomach, consuming everything. She barely ate, she barely drank, and her eyes were either ringed by black or puffy with tears. After the police gave up, she printed posters and took them around the city. She posted them everywhere she could. She questioned anyone who even glanced at them, but nothing changed. There was no news. It was, as the detective said, as if Izuku had just disappeared from the world. But that wasn't possible. He had to be somewhere. On her good days, Inko hoped he was well, that he had just forgotten her, and that he was happy. On her bad days, she cried, because that's all she could do when she imagined Izuku dead, when she imagined him being experimented on, because she knew that to some, his quirkless status would make him valuable. She barely noticed the world changing around her. What did it matter, with Izuku gone? What did it matter that Katsuki had gotten into UA, when it wasn't with Izuku? What did it matter that a villain killed one of those UA students? Izuku wasn't there. What did it matter that All Might had been forced to retire? He hadn't saved Izuku. What did anything matter? Those were the worst days, and Inko had to remind herself that she couldn't go. She had to stay, for when Izuku returned, she had to be waiting for him, and she'd cook katsudon and everything would be well. She forced herself to work, and began taking shifts with various charities. Many of those charities worked with those who were quirkless, those who society deemed worthless. Izuku was not worthless. It was through them that she learned of a new politician, one who proclaimed that he would only hire those who didn't have a quirk. Everyone was skeptical. Of course they were, but the man actually went through with it. Inko went to one of his speeches with several of the quirkless people who had been hired by his companies. It burned the first time she laid eyes on him. She just stared, her eyes wide and her mouth agape. It felt like someone had plunged a knife into her heart, but for a moment the aching emptiness was forgotten. He had green hair and green eyes. They were the exact shade of Izuku's. When she finally remembered to breath, it was in short, sharp gasps. Inko! The voice eventually got through to her. Inko, are you all right? Do we need to get you some air? She looked into the concerned face of Naoki. He was a quirkless gentleman about her own age. She had worked with him when he'd been homeless, not by choice but because he simply couldn't find anyone willing to employ him until this politician. He cleaned up well. No. Inko replied immediately. You've said so much about him, I don't want to take you away. Naoki smiled at her. If you are sure, he said in such a way that she knew he wouldn't consider it a bad thing if she had to leave. It was just what happened. I'm sure. Okay, he replied. You know, I haven't actually met him, he said. But? Naoki chuckled. He's the director. He sets the policy for the company. I'm just a programmer. Inko nodded, feeling slightly silly. She knew how that worked. But it was good that this politician was ensuring that he could employ quirkless people and the jobs weren't just those for menials. She took a deep breath and looked back at the politician who was still speaking. His hair and eyes were the exact same shade as Izuku's, but he was older, much older than her boy. He might even be older than her. He spoke well. Inko couldn't help but be taken in by his words. They were attractive. But more than that, they were realistic. There was a passion in them that engulfed those listening. He was a consummate orator, but all without making anyone feel stupid. He explained his points. Inko felt herself smile at his words. He believed them. It was a silly thought, it was one of those things she'd have never thought in the past, but this politician was exactly how she had hoped Izuku would work out. He was confident and proud without being arrogant. He had a sense of presence that reassured everyone, that said everything would be okay because he was there. Well, it wasn't. For Inko, it would only ever be okay once Izuku was home. She knew she stood out on that, but it was a surprise when he turned to her. His green eyes were kind, but somehow Inko knew he could see her pain. It came as no surprise to her that when he finished his speech he came towards their group. Naoki was gasping. Inko managed to calm him down, just as the man came up to them. You have questions? He asked. It was a challenging question, but asked such that Inko could hear his curiosity. If they did have questions, then he wanted to explain, he wanted them to understand. It was not a challenge, it was caring. No, sir, Naoki stuttered through the broken words. He smiled at the man. Relax, sir, relax. It was said in a gentle tone, as if he was laughing, but not at Naoki, with him. How have others taken your policies? Inko was surprised at her question. A very good question, ma'am. Please, call me Inko. For a split second, the politician seemed surprised. She was astounded at her boldness. Then he smiled at her. Your question is good, he repeated. I think anyone who has a problem with my policies really needs to take a good look at themselves. Discrimination against those who are quirkless is reflection on them, and their inability to see a human as human. The law and basic decency awards every human dignity. Every human, not every quirk. Inko nodded at the words. It was a well-spoken argument. But I sense you have a story, something more personal since you already know that, hmm? She managed not to jerk back, but it was a close thing. How did he know? Inko nodded. Then why don't you come with me and tell me, and I will see what I can do to help. That is how Inko found herself sitting next to Naoki across the table from the politician at a restaurant that cost more than she could possibly afford. The politician simply waved that away, telling her it was his treat. And that's how she ended up telling the man, who looked so much like she wanted to believe Izuku would be when he got to be that age, everything she knew. He nodded and asked questions at the right points. They were good questions too. He was paying attention to her, and at the end of the meal, which was lovely but like everything else, colored by the loss of Izuku and her having to remember, the politician leaned back. While no missing persons case is ever truly closed until he stopped, grimacing. Inko appreciated the tact. I'll see what I can do to get another investigation, he continued. It's been a while, so there may be new information. Inko didn't bother to suppress the flash of gratitude that went through her at the words, even if the dark, aching part of her screamed that there would be nothing found. It was crushing when that part of her was right. There was no new information. The politician sympathized with her. He sat with her the day when he brought that information. Inko had been surprised. She thought he would just do it for a stunt, but he genuinely cared. He made time for her. He shared her sadness, and while it hurt and made her cry more, Inko was comforted that he hadn't simply dismissed Izuku as just another runaway, or someone who was DEA-. No, he saw more than that. He saw hope for her, and Inko was greatly lacking in hope. She grasped it whenever she could. The whispered words were a balm to her soul. I'm sure your son, Izuku, is out there somewhere. And given what a wonderful boy you have described him as, I know he will do great things one day. There was absolutely no doubt in his tone. She held on to that. And slowly, while the ache never went away, Inko felt herself get involved again. The world no longer passed her by. It mattered when All Might's sidekick was attacked and lost his quirk. It mattered when Katsuki failed the mandated assessment and was enrolled in the general course at UA. Though Inko privately thought it would be for the best. It would force him to calm down. It mattered when the so-called League of Villains attacked a facility holding some sort of human experiment. All those things mattered. Not as much as Izuku, but they mattered. It wasn't until a bit later, when Inko had become a fixture at the politician's speeches and he'd asked permission to use Izuku as an example of the differences between those who had quirks and those who didn't, that Inko realized that slowly she had regained some balance. Slowly she had regained some life. She didn't know what to feel about that, but she couldn't stop. There was something comforting about his words. Something that reminded her of Izuku. It was more than the green hair and eyes, it was the way he felt, and the way he was kind. So many people said that this or that celebrity was kind, was a great person, but Inko knew this. That's why she was happily handing out pamphlets when it happened. She looked up and saw Izuku's eyes, Izuku's hair, Izuku's smile. She saw her son. Izuku. The name slipped out. And then Inko blinked. It wasn't Izuku, it was the politician, who was a good man but wasn't her son. He looked shocked. He was staring at her with wide eyes. Inko burst into tears. They were never far from the surface, but they overflowed now. Then she was engulfed in a hug. The politician's strong arms were around her and she was surprised by how warm he felt. He was taller than her, so her head was held against his chest. He leaned his head down, and Inko could feel his breath ruffling her hair. It's all right, Mum. Inko froze. She hadn't heard that. She couldn't have heard that. Then he drew back and gave her a soft smile. I am honored, ma'am, that you would call me your son, he said. But my name is Imoko Kakuriti. She flushed and wiped her eyes, before nodding and giving him a watery smile. Imoko bowed his head briefly before he walked away. But Inko knew what she'd heard. And her heart ached. Without Hawk's body, a determination of his fate could not be revealed to the public. Imoko has informed us, via Toga, that the HPSB is keeping a lid on the number one hero's disappearance. They have instructed his agency and sidekicks to say he is on a long-term mission. As if you could send the number one hero on a long-term mission. You can, but not one that is undercover. They are simply too recognizable. The media is keeping quiet. I understand why Hawk's sidekicks keep quiet. It's their job, but the media's job is to report. They are a part of the corruption of society. They serve the highest bidder, and soon enough that bidder will be the League. Tomura has been distracted with his toys. I thought he should be more active, that the League should be more active, but I am reassured that it will be fine. Imoku, again through Toga, gave me a message. He said it would be fine to indulge for now since time was required for the public to mull over events. Time was required for the government to do so as well. Change couldn't be achieved in a day. Or rather, it could, but that was usually brutal, temporary change. What the League wants is something more permanent. That's what Izuku was working towards, and I understand that type of change takes time. Whoever thought that one of the problems I'd experience in my career is boredom? Or not specifically boredom, but something else. Just routine. There is not much to do but tend the new bar. That should be the new bar, and try to think of anything that can be done to forward our case. We could do many things, but I do not wish the League to become known for mindless violence. Our strikes have a purpose, though the world has yet to recognize that. They will. For now, we will wait. Aizawa stood on the edge of the crowd. He wasn't sure he wanted to be here, but he had done many things in the course of his career that he wasn't sure about. He just never expected that attending a political rally would be one of them. Especially not for a very popular independent member of the House of Representatives. But Representative Imoku Kakuriti was giving a speech, and while Aizawa had listened to a lot of his speeches already, this was the first time he had been to one live. The man was a great orator. He was playing the crowd with careful words and key phrases. They were hanging on his words. It was something unheard of for a first-term representative, but there it was. Except Nedzu was right. Aizawa's investigation confirmed that there was something up with the representative. What annoyed the pro-hero was that he still didn't know what. He just couldn't find the key which would make the puzzle make sense. It was infuriating, which was why he was here. Maybe if he saw Imoku, maybe if he could feel the way Imoku moved, the way Imoku thought he could find that missing piece. He was keeping his expression hidden as Imoku talked. It was one of those topics that Aizawa really didn't like hearing about, even if it was true. Keep putting this off. We keep ignoring the obvious. We are hoping that the problem will just go away. But it's not going away, Imoku said. It won't go away that easily, he added, looking sad. Aizawa was more than sad. He was furious. The emotion was directed inwards and was directed at all the other heroes. How had they let it come to this? Many heroes are now facing retirement, or are facing lengthy times of leave. As the public we can berate that, but we cannot begrudge them. It is for their health, and while many still believe sickness is physical, those of us who are enlightened, those who are wise, recognize that sickness is in the mind as well. Thus, we must allow our heroes the time to heal, we must allow them time to recover. To do anything less would be abuse. The problem, Shoyuta thought to himself, was that the words were all very logical. The assessments were as well. It was important to maintain the mental health of heroes, or else they couldn't do the work. It's just that, in maintaining mental health, the HPSB had disqualified so many heroes and sidekicks. It would be better in the long run. Aizawa knew it, except he wasn't sure now that they had a long run, and one of the people responsible for that was standing in front of a podium. But beyond allowing those heroes who failed time to heal, we must do more. We must question why they are failing. We must question what has caused this, and then we must find a way to fix it. I already know why they are failing, Imoku said. Aizawa jerked. That was a bold statement, and the representative said it so easily as if it was something that was truth. They are failing because we have let heroes become separate. We have let them go too far away from the norm, Imoku was saying. The crowd immediately before the podium was nodding in complete agreement. Aizawa felt his lip curl upwards in disgust. Groupies. Who knew a politician could have them as well? It is therefore time to bring heroes back into the fold. Imoku said sincerely. It is time to reabsorb them into the existing structures of society. The pro-hero felt his eyes widen. He'd heard that suggestion before, but it was from some kids. This was far more serious. For a moment he saw the future. Heroes were no more. They were policemen, firefighters, and medics. They were still acting for the public good, but there was so much more they could be doing. He shivered, reaching into his pocket. There was a letter there. Aizawa had no idea how it had been delivered. It had just appeared in his notes on the case. With the signature it bore, he almost hadn't read it, but curiosity was a good trait and he wanted to know. He wanted to know how the letter had gotten there, and he wanted to know what the Yakuza named Overhaul had to say. It was a brief missive. Aizawa could remember it word for word. Shoyuta Aizawa, Pro-Hero Eraserhead. If you are reading this, then I'm dead, but someone has to know and someone has to act. The League is more than they seem. They have hidden members. Representative Imoku Kakariti is one. He is their hidden, secret weapon. You will doubt. You will deny, but you will know in your heart it is true. All you need do is look at his actions and ask yourself if they serve society, or if they serve the League. That was it. So brief, but if true, it confirmed so much. Even with all the research and stalking Aizawa had done, he couldn't find any link to the League, but Overhaul was right. In his gut he couldn't deny it. Except he couldn't prove it. And heroes, even underground ones, couldn't act without proof. His main supposed link was that Imoku Kakariti seemed to step out of thin air a few years ago. His public records were perfect, he had even paid taxes, but no one Aizawa spoke to could quite remember him. That just confirmed for Aizawa that Imoku had been someone else in the past, but he couldn't work out who. There was no missing persons report for anyone of the appropriate age and physical description. I am not suggesting that we ignore all the years of training they have put in to use their quirks. I am not suggesting that we completely ignore the possibilities inherent in quirks, but I am saying that it is beyond time that heroes were no longer separate. Too often have we seen tragedies caused by the perceived distance between heroes and others. Aizawa had a bad feeling about whatever was to come. I'm sure everyone is aware of the rescue hero team, Wild Pussycats. Their standing in the rankings dropped dramatically, more than 400 places in 1 year. This was the result of one member being injured in such a way as they cannot recover. Shoyuta grimaced. That was the nice way of saying had her quirk ripped out. Ragdoll had gotten better, but her quirk was gone and the effectiveness of the Wild Pussycats had suffered. Hero training is too valuable resource to waste. And so now, the Wild Pussycats have been integrated into other rescue forces. Not hero forces, but to those who are often overlooked, those who work beside hero forces in a disaster. Our emergency services. Thus, I believe it can be with all heroes. The distance can be destroyed. It will be better for society and better for the heroes. They will be supported. The Wild Pussycats were floundering until they realized there was support, but that support did not come from distance. Support came from inclusiveness. More recently, there is another example. The pro-hero Sir Night-Eye was injured in a battle with the League of Villains. Aizawa looked at Imoku. Was this politician going to bring up every failure heroes had made in regards to the League? Or was there another link between the League and Imoku? Did they do it because Imoku told them to? Shoyuta shivered at that thought. Was he looking at the leadership of the League? It wouldn't be the first time a politician had done something questionable in the pursuit of power. Though this was beyond questionable. But there was no evidence. If Imoku really was in charge of the league, then he was covering his tracks perfectly. Which was one reason Aizawa didn't think it was true, no matter how horrifying the thought was. Imoku just did not have the time to lead the league. Though, there was still at least one league member. Unaccounted for. The one who appeared at the USJ. The one who had only watched. No. The league wouldn't follow someone who didn't fight. Imoku looked regretful, and there was a catch in his voice as if he felt personally sad at his words. He was a brilliant actor. It is a tragedy what has happened to Sir Night-Eye, but with proper support, it wouldn't have happened. Aizawa almost growled. The politician couldn't guarantee that, but then that wasn't what the world wanted to hear. Not what the public wanted to think. They wanted to believe that with enough preparation or support, all tragedies could be avoided. With proper support from the police, Sir Night-Eye's team would have been able to handle the situation very differently, which would have led to a far better outcome, and young Mirio could have continued as a hero. But now, he will be haunted by a mission gone wrong for the rest of his life, and that is the true tragedy. It is tragic that we as a society entrust so much to those who call heroes, but then give them so little support. But that is changing. The Hero Public Safety Bureau has initiated assessments to ensure the mental health of all heroes and those who live with them. Imoku shook his head. It was an odd gesture given the positivity of the statement. Some will say that is enough. I say that is a bare minimum. It is what is done routinely for all our police officers after all. But because we persist in seeing heroes as different, as above us, we forget they are human. We forget that they have problems. That must stop, and we must as a society move to protect them. It took Aizawa a moment to recognize the small tendril of feeling that was coiling through his mind. Agreement. Savagely he shook his head. He didn't agree. Imoku was an agent for the league. How could he agree? The sharp movement brought attention, and Shoyuta found himself staring directly into brilliant green eyes. They were intense, and then they moved on, but despite the distance between them, the pro-hero could see the small smile playing around Imoku's lips. He'd been recognized, and the politician took it as a challenge. Something played at his mind. Something Night-Eye had said. Beware the hidden one. Imoku's name. It meant hidden, hide actually, Aizawa's mind corrected fastidiously. Was this the league's hidden one? Shoyuta looked back at the politician, he was still smiling. A shudder passed through the underground hero. Even if Imoku was the league, what could he do? I thought the public are beginning to make further demands to the Hero Public Safety Bureau about Hawks. The excuse that the number one hero is on a long-term mission is wearing thin. Even those on missions can make public appearances. His sidekicks are also not making it easy. They look decidedly worried. You'd think that the HPSB would train them better on how to act. Apparently Hero School doesn't have good drama classes. It is something they should invest in. Hawks continues to cling to life with a tenacity I have seldom seen, though I imagine his continued life will soon bore Tomura. In the meantime, Imoku asked to see Tomura. That was unusual. He's been adept at being distant, both for his protection and the league's, though we are one and the same. Imoku recognizes that everything will collapse if he gets embroiled in scandal. He's been meticulous in avoiding that. And the history Sensei's contacts made up for him include just a tiny bit of scandal, but nothing serious. Merely the tomfoolery associated with high school. It seemed safe enough. Imoku came at the time he was meant to be at dinner with Toga. She was left at the apartment. I brought him into the new bar. The looks from the league were interesting, especially with Tomura's greeting. The interest will blow over, especially as Dabi simply shared a wave with Imoku, implying that he was allowed here, before going back to his card game. Endeavor's son has matured. When he first joined us, he was simply a punk. Arrogantly assured of the ascendancy of his quirk and abilities. He has grown. He has seen other possibilities. He is now aware of his shortcomings and those of his team. He is becoming more competent, just as Tomura has matured. I think Sensei would be proud of the league. The vision he had is being fulfilled. Imoku and Tomura spoke for a while. He wanted to know why Hawks and Overhaul were still alive. I could tell that much while they were speaking. Tomura had an evilly pleased smile on his face at the question. Anyone would have known what they were talking about from that expression. Then they moved on to other things. At least, that is what Tomura told me. Tomura hasn't told me everything, but he informed me that Imoku had asked permission for something. Shigaraki wouldn't say what. After Imoku left, he appeared pensive. It is not an expression one associates with Tomura. He was restless, but thankfully the league has two who he could take his frustration out on. Hawks and Overhaul had not been faring well. That day was worse than usual. When Tomura was still solemn the next day, I asked what it was. He still didn't tell me. All he said was that Imoku assured him that it was information needed for the last push to destroy Hero Society. It was an interesting dichotomy. Usually Tomura would have been all for that, but for some reason this was causing him trouble. All I could do was assure him that if Imoku said it was necessary, then it would be necessary. I'm not sure it did anything, but without further information, it was all I could do. I can only hope that Tomura is feeling the sort of melancholy that comes when you know you are close to the end. It isn't something I thought he would feel, though I have seen him experience it when playing a game he particularly likes, so perhaps it's not that unusual. He will have the fortitude to see this through to the end. I know that. And that is all the league needs. Imoku looked up from his reading as the door to his office burst open. Two men he recognized strode in, following by his personal assistant who had a stricken expression on his face. I'm sorry, sir, they wouldn't wait. Kenta apologized profusely. It's all right, Kenta, he dismissed the man. I'll handle it, he added the reassurance. Why don't you make some tea for my guests? Kenta retreated with a relieved look, but was wise enough to know he wasn't quite out of the woods yet. Imoku looked at the two men who had remained silent throughout the exchange. He gave them a winning smile. May I help you, gentlemen? He got up and gestured towards the side of his office where there was a small lounge setting. It was meant for more casual discussions. He took one of the couches as the two men settled into the other one. They were still silent. Imoku gave them another smile, recognizing the tactic. They were trying to make him nervous. He let himself examine them. Shoyuta Aizawa was much the same as he remembered from the last time he had seen the pro hero. He was dressed casually, but there was a hard look in his eyes that meant you could never mistake him for a civilian. He seemed confident, but Imoku knew he'd much rather this confrontation be in some darkened back alley. He was that sort of man. The other man was very familiar, even if Imoku had only met him once before. The entire country knew who the man was. All Might in his true form. His eyes were bluer than Imoku remembered, but he was thin. The rigors of hero life clear to see upon his body. And the rigors of fighting with Sensei, Imoku couldn't help the thought. There have been several questions lately, Aizawa started. Questions? Imoku asked with a raised eyebrow. About you, this time it was All Might. Imoku shook his head, again recognizing the tactic. They were going to try to keep him off guard by switching who was talking. Amateurs. I suppose that isn't unusual, he replied coolly, given my position and all. Shoyuta gave him a thin smile. It is more serious than just questions. This is the first I've heard of anything, he said honestly. They didn't know anything, Imoku realized. If they did, neither hero would be here to simply talk. They would have barged in to arrest him. This was a fishing trip. They were hoping to trip him up to gain some sort of hint, to get some sort of leverage. I find that odd, given your connections to the League of Villains. He almost burst out laughing. He had connections, all right. That is a very serious accusation, Imoko said flatly, letting them know he felt insulted but for the moment prepared to let them drive the conversation. It is, and it is a crime that carries quite a few penalties, All Might told him before. Falling silent as Kenta knocked. Imoko's executive assistant entered, carrying a tray. The three men remained silent as Kenta brought the tray to the table, laying out 3 teacups and a pot of tea. He then rose, gave a small bow and left. Imoko leaned forward. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, picking up the pot, indicating towards the cups. Both heroes shook their head. His lips quirked and Izuku poured himself a cup, before setting the pot down. He picked up the cup and took a small sip to prove to them that it wasn't contaminated with either poison or some other concoction. "That is a very serious accusation," Imoko repeated. "And I cannot help the belief that you have some false intelligence if you have truly come to that conclusion." They were fishing for information, but he could fish as well. The two heroes shared a look. "You won your position as a representative in the wake of All Might's final fight with the man believed to have founded the League," Aizawa said. "You campaigned on the premise of finding a way to reduce villain-related crime. Which I will tell you honestly, and in confidence, might have been a bit of a stretch, given my status as an independent," Imoku admitted, taking another sip of tea. He could see the way they reacted to that. They weren't sure what he meant. "The thing is, you were the only politician ready to capitalize on my forced retirement," All Might said. The introduction of the Heroes Must Be Heroes bill was timed to perfection. Almost as if you knew what was going to happen. Imoku opened his green eyes wide. "I had no idea," he growled, not bothering to hide the insult he felt. "And like the rest of the world, I was horrified to see what happened." Of course, he was horrified to see Sensei lose, but Izuku understood now that it had been a necessary step. The man had contingencies for everything, to turn every event into something the League could benefit from, even his own defeat. Yet you did not stop. With the fall of Endeavor, the bill continued. It expanded to target Shudo. It was a very well-timed amendment. There was a touch of admiration in Aizawa's voice. "You credit me with too much," Imoku dismissed the underground pro-hero's words. "Though I am forced to question your motives. The HMBH bill and its amendments, all of them, are designed to help heroes. They are designed to ensure the continued mental health of heroes, and by extension, society. Or are you saying that heroes should be scarred by their work? That they should accept the pain and the heartache as some sort of price required to do their job? That is a barbaric thought, and it is one I reject utterly." The two heroes looked horrified. Had they not thought about that? They must have, or were they horrified by one they thought of as a villain could be so eloquent in the protection of heroes? Imoka didn't know, but it was somewhat amusing. "Heroes are trained to deal with the stress of the job," Aizawa said. Imoka gave him a smile, one that clearly questioned his sanity. "With so many heroes failing even the basic HPSB psyche assessments, I am forced to wonder how you can draw that conclusion, He tilted his head to emphasize his question. There was no real argument that could be made against that, not with the number of retirements there had been recently. At least the pro-hero had the good taste to remain silent. Not everyone who has become a hero recently has done so for the right reasons, All Might was forced to admit. And that has led to this, Imoku added on to the former number one hero statement. If this testing had have existed earlier, then maybe things would have been different, maybe more of those called heroes would truly be heroes. All Might cleared his throat. There have been some mistakes made, he admitted, looking down. But you have led the government in inflating the mistakes. Imoku blinked at the hero. I fail to see how I could be leading the government, he said. I am an independent representative, he reminded the heroes. With an undocumented quirk, Aizawa snapped. Excuse me? Imoku demanded, indignantly. He practiced the precise tone to ensure that the only hint of surprise in his voice was at the very suggestion, not because the suggestion was the truth. It took me a while to understand what happened at your speech, the underground pro-hero said. I found myself Agreeing with you. Imoku snorted. And you think it was because of a quirk? He shook his head. More likely you agree with my stance, though you cannot professionally admit it. No, you were using a quirk. Something subtle. Something to make me agree. You are aware of my quirk, correct? Imoku asked. He put his now empty teacup down and raised one hand. Spark, he said, allowing several sparks to burst from the tips of his fingers. It was a pretty display, almost like a sparkler. That is my quirk, Imoku said. It is not some sort of mind control quirk, he scoffed. Undocumented quirk, Aizawa repeated. And as a member of the League, it wouldn't be too difficult to have that man give you a covering quirk, the underground hero said. And you've been using it to get the public to agree and to get the government to agree. You do know that all representatives undergo routine scans? Imoku asked. Scans? Aizawa appeared confused for a moment. To ensure that we are not under the control of any quirk. To ensure that the decisions we make are our decisions. So, all I can say is that you have a good imagination, Imoku sighed tiredly. Perhaps you are in the wrong industry, he added. I think though, it is an aspect of your concern, he continued, lowering his hand. Imoku allowed his eyes to meet Aizawa's. I can understand that. Things are changing, he added. And it is human nature to fear change. It is only natural, even for heroes. He couldn't help but add the jab. The underground hero glared at him, but Imoku knew that he'd won the argument. They were hoping he'd become flustered at the mention of a second quirk. Did they really think Sensei had chosen so poorly? Or, more likely, they thought he was like Tomura. Huh? That made more sense, and he was insulted all the more for the realization. You are destroying the people's faith in heroes, All Might said. Imoku looked at the hero. He was much the same as he had been that time, though there was an air of tiredness about him that hadn't been there previously. I prefer to think I am helping the system evolve to a changing need, he replied mildly. Allow me to tell you what I envisage, Imoku continued when neither hero appeared to be willing to speak. And you will see that change isn't that scary, he added. It was amusing to be treating them like children, but if that's what it took, then he would do that. He shook his head. You see, I truly believe that there has been a growing gulf between heroes and the rest of society. It started with you, All Might, Imoku said. Me? The man seemed surprised. You, Imoku confirmed. You were too much of a hero. Interestingly, Aizawa seemed to understand where Imoku was going with this. Too perfect, too strong. He held up one hand before the hero could object. It is only in hindsight can we see the problems that has caused. People became complacent. They began to see heroes in your image. They began to see heroes as perfect, infallible beings. We both know that's not the case, but that is what the people saw, and that was the beginning of the chasm. And so now, when heroes are being shown to be human, the pain is more. It is unfortunate, but it is a consequence that we have to deal with. He sighed. The future will be better, Imoku said. And I don't see a future where there is a gulf between heroes and the rest of society. I see heroes, those trained to use their quirks, as being a part of society. An important part, because quirks are a strength humans should use, but we can no longer allow heroes to be considered separate. We can no longer allow them to be put on a pedestal, allowed to be thought of as somehow better. Did you once try to be a hero? The question was sudden, and came from All Might. Did I once try to be a hero? Imoku asked, confused. Yes, All Might nodded. Is that where your resentment of heroes comes from? Imoku took a deep breath. Once, long ago, I might have thought about it, he admitted. Almost. Every child thought about being a hero at some stage. It would be stupid if he completely denied the thought. But then, it was actually a hero who taught me a valuable lesson, Imoku said, fixing his green eyes on All Might. The hero might remember Izuku, but he would never link Izuku to Imoku, not with the years he had given to Sensei. Even so, Izuku couldn't help but take some satisfaction from his words. I was told that without a suitable quirk, I should keep my dreams realistic. That I should aim only for what was achievable, he said. Imoku felt a sharp stab of gratification at the stricken words on All Might's face. Maybe he did remember Izuku. So I turned to business, and then to politics. Far more mundane, Imoku joked, watching as All Might settled his expression again. So, in the future, I see those trained to use their quirks working with the police, as part of the police. Not as heroes, not separately, but as a part of the police force, a special response unit or similar, he explained. That why their mental health will be fully monitored and they will always have the support of those who understand. Those who work as rescue heroes will be a part of the emergency services. There is no need for us to ignore quirks. In the right circumstance, they are very useful, but it is a matter of ensuring that we use the right quirk at the right time. Integration may seem weird, but will be for the best in the long run. Imoku gave the heroes a bright smile. They just looked back at him with hard eyes. Imoku's expression shifted, becoming more smug, and his smile morphed into a smirk. An interesting vision, All Might eventually said in such a way as Imoku could hear what he really meant. You won't get away with it. He was reminded of Overhaul with Kurogiri's mist surrounding him, screaming that he wouldn't win. Imoku gave All Might a look. He couldn't say it, but he could feel it. I think we have taken enough time from the representative, Aizawa said, rising. All Might agreed. I do thank you for coming to me with your concerns, gentlemen, Imoku said. I hope I've been able to allay those concerns, he added. I'm sure we will be seeing you again, All Might said. Imoku nodded as he showed the two heroes to the door. One day, he agreed and was pleased to see that Aizawa caught Imoku's true meaning. The door closed and Imoku heard them talking to Kenta before the heroes' voices disappeared. He walked back to the couch, collapsing onto it. Kenta, Imoku yelled. Cancel the rest of my appointments for today, he instructed, rubbing at his temples. He didn't need a response from his executive assistant as he began to think. The heroes had their suspicions, but they couldn't prove anything. Even so, he would have to be careful when he met with Tomura. And no, he'd need the League even after heroes were gone. Some heroes would become vigilantes and they would have to be dealt with, since he couldn't expect any hero who integrated into the police forces to actually do that job with any degree of effort. A smile creased his features as he remembered All Might's expression when he suggested that dreams had to be kept realistic. Maybe the hero did remember Izuku. Too late though. It was far too late and he'd made his choice. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, a boy who idolized heroes. He was Imoku Kakariri, the man who would save everyone, so that heroes were no longer necessary. Heroes would be the last people he'd save. But he would save them. From themselves. Things Kurogiri doesn't. No, Katsuki Bakugi, you will be given the opportunity to retest at the midpoint of this year. And at the end of the year. What? Nothing sounded quite as outraged as an entitled 16-year-old. Do you understand? Anoka asked evenly. She was not getting paid enough to deal with this crap. No. I do not accept it, the brat snarled, slamming his hands down on the table. She could hear small explosions coming from his hands. Anoka realized it had something to do with his quirk. Young man, public use of your quirk is not permitted, she told him. That got her a glare. That's fucking nothing. She was definitely not being paid enough to deal with this. Language, young man, she warned. No. This is bullshit. It's some bullshit fucking test made up because some fucker whinged to their daddy cause they fucking couldn't keep up. Anoka fixed him with her own glare. Young man, I assure you the Hero Public Safety Bureau is not influenced by someone crying to their father. She spat his words back at him. The mental health assessment is an initiative from the government to ensure the health and safety of those attempting to be heroes. It is for your benefit. It is fucking not. Further explosions came from his hands. Young man, if you use your quirk one more time, I will recommend a suspension from UA until you can properly control your quirk, as it is unfortunate to see one so old have such poor control. Usually by the time anyone turns 5 they can consciously control their quirk. Anoka schooled her expression into something neutral. Really, what was UA teaching if this sort of control was normal? You're not fucking UA. Young man, I am a member of the Hero Public Safety Bureau, and while we do not traditionally interfere with specific students, except when directed, I assure you, I do have that power. It shouldn't have made her feel good, but his spluttering was rather pleasing. There were no further explosions. At least she'd gotten that much through. Do you understand? Anoka asked her earlier question. This is fucking bullshit, he repeated. The assessment is for your own benefit, and you may retest. As you failed, this is not negotiable. I am the best fucking student UA has. The teen slammed his hands into the table again. In grades, perhaps, Anoka allowed. But you lack the appropriate mental attitude to become a hero. You lack humility, compassion, and from your display today, I can only judge that the assessments were implemented just in time. You would be. She shook her head. This boy was one of the most unsuited to being a hero that she had ever seen. It was as if no one had ever told him no. Well, thankfully the HPSB had that power, and even though she wasn't being paid enough to deal with this sort of thing, it was just as well she was. I'll fucking appeal this. Anoka smiled. It was slightly vicious. There is no appeal, she told him. What? There were explosions again. That's fucking insane. In due course, you may retest. She told him. Thought before that I would advise that you seek help. He glared. You are dismissed, Anoka added, raising one hand and making a small shooing motion. It was a petty revenge, but she wasn't being paid to deal with this shit. AFO, these are the results? Yes, Representative Kakariti, Anoka nodded nervously. She was paying particular attention to her breathing. She hadn't expected to have to present the results of the assessment to one of the members of the House of Representatives. Just relax, the representative murmured as he looked at the papers. Anoka flushed. She wasn't aware her nerves were showing that much. She forced herself to take a deep breath. It made some sense, Anoka supposed. The HPSB assessments were new, and Representative Imoko Kakariti had been behind the initial legislation, so of course he would be interested. She was surprised when he hissed. Oh dear, he muttered. Anoka looked over. She couldn't tell what record he was on but was surprised. When he looked up, his eyes were a rich green, she noted. That didn't come out in publicity. Photos. Did you have any problems? Sir? Did you have any problems when you informed the students? Oh, she understood now. Since it was the first time the assessment had been performed, it had been deemed that each student who failed should be informed personally. That way their options could be explained in detail and any questions they had be dealt with. It was a lot of work, but it was the first time, and setting these things up often took more work to make it smoother for the future. She winced at the member. There were several who were disappointed, she told him diplomatically. His expression changed to display exaggerated patience. Just disappointed, he asked pointedly. Anoka took another deep breath. May I speak in confidence, Representative Kakariti? The representative closed his eyes briefly and put the papers down. Anoka, he said seriously. I represent my electorate. I am here to promote their interests, which means I have to know their interests. That means they have to tell me, and even if they go against my desires, I will represent them. As such, I expect you to tell me the truth. You will not be punished for it, he assured her. She nodded, feeling reassured. Imoko Kakariti was an independent. He didn't listen to the party line. There were several who seemed to expect the results and who, I feel, will in time mature and be able to rejoin their hero course, but there were others who were. She fished for the right word. Difficult, Anoka concluded. He nodded sympathetically. That is disappointing, but unfortunately not unexpected, he told her. You did well to meet with them, and I will see that you are rewarded for that difficult task. That's not necessary, sir. I was just doing my job. She was just doing her job, and sometimes that meant doing difficult things. You deserve it, Imoku pressed. Anoka gulped. Thank you, sir. She knew when to quit when she was ahead. Then I thank you for a job well done, he said. Anoka nodded and rose, giving the representative a small bow before. She left. AFO, you wanted to see me, sir? Juro Abe said as he came into the office. Imoka looked up at the man. He was the current chair of the Hero Public Safety Commission's committee. I did, Imoku said. You've seen these? He asked, holding up the papers Anoka had delivered earlier. Juro winced. Yes. He seated himself at Imoko's desk, looking over at the representative. The desk was surprisingly clean. There was a name badge and a leather inlay for writing and some sort of ornament, but apart from that, the desk was clean. A tablet lay to Imoko's side, but the screen was blank. Juro knew there was probably an inbuilt keyboard somewhere. They aren't good reading, are they? Not at all, sir, Juro agreed. The mental health assessments of the hero students was not good reading. They didn't have the actual assessments, just the overall results, and the summary notes about each individual. That maintained privacy while giving the HPSB a background on the reason the individual either passed or failed. I am particularly worried about this one, Imoka said, sliding a paper over his desk. Juro picked it up, his eyes immediately going for the name. Katsuki Bakugu. He knew that name. The boy had placed first on UA's entrance exam and at the sports festival, but his assessment highlighted anger and arrogance as being two very large problems. It was interesting that despite the anger and arrogance, Katsuku had done very well on some of the other parts of the assessment. From what I understand, Juro said after a moment, this Bakugo boy will need some serious anger management therapy. Assuming he can get a handle on his anger, he will then be able to retest and should pass. That's what worries me, Imoka said delicately. Sir? Juro frowned. There is no question that this Katsuki Bakugo is both academically and physically skilled. And he has been blessed with a powerful quirk, Imoku explained. That conclusion was very clear. Katsuki was not the number one in his class, but he was in the top 5, though physically he was vying for the number 1 position. He truly did understand what it took to be a hero, at least in a physical matter. Mentally, there were problems there. But it is the very nature of that quirk which bothers me. Juro looked at the page, reading the description. Explosions from nitroglycerin sweat. Quick and flashy, Imoku said. Juro nodded his understanding. That was a reasonable conclusion. Quirks didn't define the personality, but they could influence it. As I said, sir, he will need some serious anger management therapy, Juro repeated carefully, feeling out what the representative wanted. I think it might take more than that, Imoku said. I want you to look into his past, specifically his middle school history, he added. You know something? Juro asked, putting the paper back on the representative's desk. I suspect, Imoku told him. You know my stance on quirkless people? Ah, yes, sir. The representative had made his stance very clear, and went so far as to only hire quirkless people. He had received quite a large swell of public support for the initiative. Juro was actually thankful for it. His cousin was quirkless and had now managed to find a job, not with one of Kakuridi's companies, but with others who realized they were missing out on a resource. It made a lot of sense. 20% of the population was quirkless. 1 in every 5 people. That was a lot of votes. It was a lot of labor to just be ignoring. One of the stories I've heard actually relates to Katsuki Bakugo. Jiro blinked. There are always stories, sir, he said tactfully. He could imagine what some of them said though. Imoku nodded. I know, which is why I am asking you to investigate. And then the representative paused. And then, sir? Green eyes lanced into him. Jiro shivered and he felt like he was drowning in them. If you do find something, Jiro, I would take it as a personal favor if you ensured that Katsuki Bakugo never passes a reassessment. You want me to rig his results? Jiro breathed, but then it felt like he had no breath. His lungs were constricted somehow by bands of steel around his chest. He stared into the representative's eyes. I want you to make a judgment based on what you find, Imoku corrected meticulously. Sir, I see a - Jiro stopped when Imoku raised one hand. He felt that he had to. I trust you will make the right decision, given the evidence, the representative said gently. Jiro swallowed. It was not quite a threat, but he recognized the power the representative had, even as an independent. I will make a decision given the evidence, he said. Very good, Imoku smiled. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, sir, Jiro said as he rose. Merely doing my duty. Jiro nodded and left the office. He managed to make it back to his own office before he collapsed, breathing hard. Imoku Kakariri was. Dealing with the Prime Minister was easier. Or the budgeting committee, or the temperamental heroes. But, he pulled up the file on Katsuki Bakugo, rereading the information. Jiro couldn't help but think that Representative Kakariri knew something, and it was something about this Katsuki. He almost didn't want to know what, because as much as he couldn't rig the assessment results, he had an awful feeling once he knew what the representative knew, he'd want to. He wasn't sure he'd be able to stop Wafapu. Imoku turned at the shout. So did the group with him? The word had been spat by a teen. He had messy blonde hair and his eyes were wide and fanatical. The group with Imoku took a step back while the representative just looked on. He'd always remember that face. Katsuki Bakugo. And it looked as if life hadn't been kind to his childhood friend. May I help you, young man? Imoku said. He almost burst out laughing when he said the words. Katsuki's face flashed in anger. Imoku could see the rage there. In the past he would have quailed, now he just waved off his bodyguards. He usually didn't bother with them, but at these rallies they were useful. It's fucking your fault. Bakugo screamed at him. My fault? Imoku questioned in confusion. Inwardly he was laughing. Oh, it was his fault, all right, in so many more ways than Katsuki knew. You are the one fucking responsible for those fucking assessments. There were small explosions coming off Katsuki's palms. You mean the mental health assessment for heroic potential? Yes, you bastard. You may retest, Imoku said. No, I can't, you moron. Bakugo screamed. It's your stupid fucking test. It has no benefit. My boy, Imoku said, knowing that the pleasantry would only infuriate Bakugo further. The assessment is for your benefit, to ensure your mental stability. Imoku could tell the group around him didn't think the boy was stable at all. He had caught the fact that Bakugo said he couldn't retest. It was amusing. That must mean Katsuki had either taken his retests or Jiro had actually listened to him. Either option was perfect. This was an unexpected opportunity. He had been content to just forget Katsuki, but since he was here, Izuku would indulge himself. After all, some things required the personal touch. No. It's your fucking way of lowering the fucking bar. The fucking pansies couldn't handle it. You fucking quirkless lover. With the last, Katsuki leapt towards him, hands already bursting with explosions. He roared and then he faltered, looking at his hands. What? Sensei had given Imoko the quirk spark. Imoko had only ever shown anyone a pretty display of sparks, like a sparkler, but he had practiced with it until he had absolute control. Katsuki Bakugo's quirk relied on making small sparks in his hand that ignited his sweat. He couldn't create explosions with Imoko suppressing the sparks. Using your quirk in public is very dangerous, Imoko scolded. You bastard! Bakugo screamed. Imoko gave him a smile. No one ever said Katsuki was slow. He'd figured out that he'd done something. I'll get you. He charged again. Again, Imoko waved off his bodyguards before he moved, intercepting Bakugo. The boy had trained, but Imoko had matured and trained. He was no longer Izuku, no longer the small boy Katsuki had known. As an adult he had greater reach, and that was enough. He caught Bakugo's shirt and pulled. The extra momentum made Katsuki lose his balance. Imoko supported him and leaned forward so that his mouth was at Bakugo's ear. Imoko continued suppressing Bakugo's explosions. If you want to be a hero that badly, there's a quick way to do it, he whispered. Bakugo froze. He became stiff. Imoko smirked, his expression hidden by his position close to Katsuki. Believe that you'll be born with a better attitude in your next life, and take a last chance dive off the roof, Izuku finished, releasing Katsuki as he took a step back. The boy collapsed. His red eyes were wide, and stared into the distance. He remembered those words. Imoko looked down at him for a moment before he moved on. Imoko heard Katsuki's cry. He looked back, allowing his eyes to meet Bakugo's. There was a flash of recognition before confusion covered the teen's face. There was so much more Imoko wanted to say, but it was best left between them. He nodded once, giving Katsuki a smug smile before he turned away, dismissing his old friend who was now looking at his hands, tears streaming from his face. It was pathetic really, if Bakugo still couldn't face reality. Imoko chuckled. Which of the extras had said that? It didn't matter. He'd remember the feeling of Katsuki collapsing under his grip for a long time to come. It was so nice when things just worked out. Tomura is not one to replay a game. Nor is he one to go easy when he does play. Thus I was slightly surprised that both Hawks and Overhaul survived as long as they did. I suppose that is testament to their desires rather than Tomura's. Once finished with them, the League dumped both bodies. We are not so crude as to display them, as some might have. They were just dumped, though there was also no hiding the extent of their injuries. They were left where the police would find them. We are villains, not complete monsters, and it would not do for a civilian to find them. The police did find the bodies, but they couldn't keep the news from the media. The public exploded. Most did not care about Overhaul. They cared about Hawks. It had been noticed that the #1 hero had not been seen. The Hero Public Safety Bureau's story was weak and was based on the assumption that Hawks had continued with their infiltration plan. It relied on the League being ignorant, trusting, and uninformed. We are none of those things. Villains who have those weaknesses do not survive long. With the fall of Hawks, the League took out another #1 hero. It was getting to be our thing, especially since we hadn't lost that many, and those we had lost, the heroes knew we'd replaced. All Might. Taken down by Sensei. Their final battle has gone down in history as the embodiment of good versus evil. Society is so predictable that way. Endeavor. Taken out by his son. It wasn't even a battle, more the opening of eyes to the evils the hero perpetuated. Hawks. Taken out by the League. By Izuku really, though the League are the ones who fought. It was inevitable that the winged hero would fall. On some of the more morbid public forums there was betting as to how long Best Jeanist would last until the League took him out. We wouldn't need to. The world was changing. Imoko reported that he had been confronted by Eraserhead and All Might's husk of a body. He assured Tomura that everything was in hand. Usually I would doubt such a thing, but this is Imoko. I know I can trust him. If things are in hand, then things are in hand and progressing as they are meant to. I doubt the heroes have such certainty. And the fall of another number one hero sends an unmistakable message from the League to the world. We're going away, and no amount of effort from the heroes can dislodge us. It is now time for things to come to an end, for the League's goal to be achieved. It is time for the heroes to fall off. This is unacceptable. Deputy Prime Minister Kiyoshi Takanaka slammed one hand on the table as he glared at those sitting there. Papers jumped into the air before fluttering back down. The committee of the Hero Public Safety Bureau just looked at him. The men and women were expressionless. They were counted as civilians. They were not heroes, or even ex-heroes, but they were politicians, and they recognized that the Deputy Prime Minister outranked them. There was a small group assembled behind him, including the Minister for Heroes, Yumiko Yamashita, who was technically their boss. She looked miserable and refused to meet their eyes. "Sir, with due respect, what is unacceptable?" one of the braver members of the committee asked. "This," Kiyoshi snapped, gripping the papers and holding them up. The committee squinted but couldn't make out what was on them. "This is the result of an investigation one of the junior members of the House of Representatives has initiated." The listening committee didn't say anything. Those who were more astute nodded slightly now. Understanding why the independent member of the House of Representatives, Imoko Kakariri, was standing with the other government officials. It was his investigation. It explains in horrifying detail exactly how the so-called leader of the League of Villains, one Tomura Shigaraki, became the murderous bastard he is today. The committee didn't know how to react to that. The heroes had been chasing after the League of Villains since they appeared, but it seemed as if every encounter things just got worse for them. From the USJ, to the kidnapping of a US student, through to the attacks by the mindless beasts, the League kept to the toppling of the number one ranked pro-heroes. The League appeared to be ahead of the heroes at every turn. They were too well informed. And you know, after reading it, I honestly can't say that I blame Tomura, Kiyoshi said. It was something he'd never admit in public. "Sir?" The committee didn't know what was written in the investigation. Every single way Tomura was failed by the system, Kiyoshi said, flicking the papers on the table, to allow the committee to pick them up. There was silence as the committee read the documents. "This is preposterous," one of the committee members exclaimed. She obviously read faster than the others. "You cannot blame everything that has gone wrong in that nutjob's life on us." Not everything, the Deputy Prime Minister allowed. But at every important juncture, every time when he could have been turned from villainy, heroes failed. "We have not." "With respect, Madam," Imoko stepped forward. "I do not believe Deputy Prime Minister Takanaka is saying that every hero has failed. Nor is he saying that the HPSB has failed, but there have been opportunities where the system failed." "You," one of the others said. Imoku understood the question. "I commissioned the investigation because I was curious to know how a man becomes that," he said, the last with some distaste. "No one grows up wanting to be a villain after all, so how did Tomura Shigaraki become that? That's what I wanted to know." He took a deep breath for effect. "But it is not just Tomura Shigaraki, it is also Kaichi Sakai, Kaizo Makaguro, Teruo Hazukashi, Aji Harima, Shin Nemoto. I could go on. Who the hell are they?" "That's the point," the Deputy Prime Minister said. "They are people. They are people society calls villains because that is a convenient tag. They've all been failed by the system. For those who the system saves, those who the system lifts up, there are those it crushes, those who the system forgets. Since the advent of the hero age, we have seen villain after villain, tragedy after tragedy. They should not be normal, but yet, somehow we have normalized it all under the name of villainy." The Deputy Prime Minister took a deep breath. "Sir, that is why we need heroes," one of the committee members said. "Heroes are the only ones authorized to deal with quirk-related crimes." Kiyoshi snorted. "Because Everyone who uses their quirk in public is somehow a villain, he said sarcastically. No, I don't accept it. The government doesn't accept it, and we both know full well that most of those called villains are not. They are simply criminals, those who have lost their way. We call them villains to maintain the image of heroes. And we have had to work darn hard to maintain the image of heroes, the deputy prime minister snorted. How many deaths have we had to cover up? He demanded. None, sir. Shut up, Kiyoshi snapped, ignoring the speaker. How many have been killed by hero-related efforts which we have just conveniently blamed on the villain? He reiterated his question, giving it more context. Understanding crossed the features of the committee. They were not stupid. They knew how in taking down some villains, collateral damage included injuries, and sometimes the deaths of those caught in the crossfire. The deaths were always blamed on the villain because after all, if the villain hadn't acted in the first place, then how could the hero be guilty of something that happened in their apprehension? Then how will we deal with quirk-related crime? The same way as we deal with non-quirk-related crime, Kiyoshi was quick to reply. In making the distinction, we somehow say that those who use their quirks are either more or less than human. We forget that they are human. The system feeds villainy, so instead of being trapped in a self-perpetuating loop, we are going to do better. As a group, the committee looked miserable. The Minister for Heroes just hung her head. She felt some vindication. She had been telling them to deal with the League for months, years even, and this was because of their inability. Imoka's report was just the final straw. In 2 days' time, the government will be holding a conscience vote. The question will be if we continue the current system, the system that churns out villain after villain, that turns those who could have been heroes into one of the most hardened criminals we know, or if we should move on to something better, something stronger. I know which way the government will be voting, Kiyoshi said, even though technically a vote of conscience allowed all to vote according to their personal feelings. Sir, you can't. We can, Kiyoshi replied, and the reason is in your hands, he added, picking up the front page of the report. Tomura Shigaraki, true name, Tenko Shimura, grandson of Nana Shimura. He didn't read further. He didn't need to. They recognized the name of the woman. She had been a hero who had fallen before All Might's debut, but she was still remembered. She was one of the best. All Might had taken up her mantle. This is a boy who should have been a child of the system. Instead, he has rejected the system, who has become the bane of the system. And he's not the only one. The system is broken and it is beyond time it was fixed. You can either be part of that fix, or you can be forgotten. Imoka hit a smile at that. The committee were public servants, being forgotten, being deemed irrelevant, was being fired. Heroes will be integrated into society. They can join the military, the police, the emergency services. They can apply for quirk usage permits to help with other jobs, but they will no longer be special. They will not longer be a part. Society can no longer support that distinction. Then how will we deal with the League? The question was asked timidly. Personally, Izuku was disappointed at that. So far it was the most pointed question relating to the situation. He had thought on the League as well, though his solution was far different than the government's. They will be dealt with. If we have to bring in the military, then we will, but they will be dealt with, Kiyoshi assured them before he sighed. This is a failure of the system, so we will fix the system. It will be difficult, but in the long run, it will be worth it. That is what I believe, he said firmly, before looking around the room. And that is the message you will give your people going forward, he ordered. Because that was what the government wanted, and what the government wanted, the government got. Even over the backs of heroes, AFO, the end came without fanfare. Most expect the achievement of their goals to come in the aftermath of combat. For us it was nothing like that. The League didn't even know about it until Imoku told us. The government had voted. Heroes were to be integrated back into society. They were no more. Of course, it was not quite that simple. They would exist for a while yet. Integration would take time, but the League has one. It is an interesting feeling. One of relief yet one of sorrow. It leaves one at a loss. Imoku has requested to visit us. Tomura agrees. I'm not sure what he wants, but probably to tie up a few loose ends. I can already see the future. Those we call heroes will be integrated into existing structures. The police, the military, and emergency services. I'm sure some were better suited for them anyway. I am equally sure that some heroes will resist the change. That's what is amusing me at the moment. Heroes have always played by the rules, but now those very rules favor us. There will be vigilantes. Those heroes who do not want to give it all up. They will be hunted by those heroes who do integrate. The battles will be interesting. It is always fun to see former friends fighting each other when they are not your former friends. I suspect others will retire, seeking entirely new jobs. Some of their quirks are more suited to other industries after all. I'm interested to see what the students do, those who pass the assessments. There are those amongst them who truly want to be heroes to help people. That has now been torn away. I wonder what they will do, how they will adapt. I wonder what schooling will be put in place for them to help them change. It is not my concern, but it is all interesting. The change from one regime to another is never without pain. This change has been smooth, because we have managed it, but I expect there will be issues we don't know about. The League is one thing. With our goal achieved, what are we to do now? What will come of those charges that have been laid against us? As far as I know, we all have charges laid against us in absentia. For the moment, I guess it means we must be careful, but this is the beginning of the end. It is the beginning of the change we desired. We can only look forward now. AFO Imoku looked around the bar with a sense of nostalgia. It seemed the League gravitated towards bars as their norm. It wasn't the first time he'd been here, but it was the first time he had had the time to look around. Kurojiri was behind the bar, wiping a glass. Tomura was sitting in a darkened corner, and Dabi and a few others were present. Izuku! Toga cried cheerfully when she saw him. Himiko, he chided her. Oops. She said, but didn't sound very regretful. Only in private, Toga told him in a sing-song voice, one that implied she could recite that phrase from many, many memories. She laughed and flicked her knives away, sheathing them under her uniform. Only in private, Imoku repeated with a smile. Dabi laughed at the interaction. Imoku, my man, what brings you here? The fire villain asked. Imoku smiled. A bit of this, a bit of that. The vote? Endeavor's son pressed. The vote, Imoku confirmed, looking at Tomura. Tomura only had a few hands on him today, and none covered his face. You've done well, Imoku, he told the politician. Sensei expected it, Imoku replied with a shrug. Kurojiri poured a beer, and slid it over the counter toward Izuku. He picked it up, turning to lean against the bar as he drank deeply. Gah! Izuku breathed deeply. Your beer is the best, Kurojiri, he said. The rest of the League knew better than to make any quip about the quality of the beer. They all wanted to maintain their drinking rights. Have there been challenges? Kurojiri asked. The vote might have been taken, but a countervote was always a possibility. There are always challenges, Kurojiri, but nothing that can't be overcome. There was a note in Imoku's voice that spoke of the future. Kurojiri could tell that Tomura picked it up as well. By the way the League's leader shifted slightly. What do you mean? He demanded. Exactly what? I said, Tomura, Imoku told him. There are always challenges. But it's over. Tomura objected. We've won. Izuku cocked his head at Tomura. Kurojiri recognized the gesture from years ago, when they were both learning from Sensei. Is that what you believe? Imoku asked Tomura. Of course, he declared. The heroes are gone. They can't attack us. They can't do anything against us. It's time we went out there to show that we have one, he growled. Imoku shook his head. Not yet, he said gently. What do you mean, not yet? Tomura growled. It was only because he had experience with Imoku that he even bothered to ask. Exactly what it sounds like, Imoku said. You go out there now and you could jeopardize everything. Tomura snorted. You don't know that and you forget your place. You are meant to serve me. You are meant to do what I tell you to. I'm not meant to do what you tell me to. Kurogiri picked up a new glass too. Clean. He had a feeling this argument had been building for a while and he had seen parts of it. Earlier. Years back. Izuku had even said it. Sensei said it as well. Tomura was to inherit everything and Izuku was a part of that everything. Izuku had said that too. But Imoku was his own man, and he had a different role to fulfill. Toga pulled out a knife as she watched. She began cleaning her fingernails with it, flicking invisible dirt onto the bar floor. I was put in place to ensure that the league wins, Imoku countered. And sometimes that means restraint. But it's over. Tomura objected. Izuku sighed heavily. You can't believe that, he said, his voice disbelieving. It is over, Tomura repeated, rising from his seat. We've won. This isn't a game, Izuku countered. There is no last level. No final boss, he used the terminology. And there is no final victory. Kurogiri blinked wondering what Izuku meant. From the looks on the faces of the other members of the league they were wondering that as well. But Izuku had a point. This wasn't a game and maybe Tomura was thinking of it like that. He had probably not thought what happened next. Imoku obviously had. He looked at Sensei's two students, nodding to himself. We have won, Tomura repeated, as if he was speaking to a small child. And if you go out now, the vote will be meaningless. The vote will be overturned, Imoku said. Then make it stick. It's not that simple. Tomura. Dabi said. Shut up. The leader of the league growled as he stalked towards Imoku. It's not that simple, Imoku repeated. Don't. Tomura growled. Don't you dare use your quirk on me. He shouted. I wouldn't do that, Tomura, Imoku said. Bullshit. You'd use it. You have used it, you just don't think I noticed. Well, I have. For a moment Kurogiri didn't think it was possible. Izuku's quirk was spark, then he saw Izuku's smile and he was reminded that Sensei had said he had given the boy two quirks. One was sparks and the other. He didn't know what the other was. But some sort of persuasion quirk did seem likely given the information he had on hand. Izuku put his glass of beer back on the bar as he leaned into it, resting both elbows on the counter. He looked up at Tomura confidently. Given the outcome, you know it was necessary. No more, Tomura barked. No more, Imoku agreed easily. But, you can't go out now, his voice was firm. I don't obey you. Yeah, that's the problem, Izuku muttered. For a moment Tomura froze, then he spluttered. We've gotten so far, because I've kept you on track, Imoku continued provoking Tomura. Kurogiri felt he should say something but he couldn't really think of anything. This was between them. All you have to do now for total victory is lay low for a little. All we have to do is obey you? Tomura rephrased it. If you want to think of it like that, Izuku shrugged. The bartender knew that was the wrong thing to say. He suspected Izuku knew as well, but the boy was intent on provoking Tomura today. There was something else going on here. I do not obey you. Tomura snapped. The League does not obey you, he continued, ignoring the amused look Izuku was giving him. And you will either agree to obey me or you won't leave, Tomura threatened. He held out his hand. Imoku knew very well what his quirk did in Spark or some other quirk was not going to protect him from Tomura's decay. Kurogiri blinked before he nodded to himself again. He should have been expecting this. Toga snorted a bark of laughter. She was watching intently, as were the others of the league. Most didn't know who Imoku was. His suit was not normal attire for the bar, but his ease with Toga, Dabi and Kurogiri convinced them that he should be here. Arguing with Tomura only went further to assuring them that Imoku, whoever he was, had every right to be here. Izuku looked at Tomura. "No," he said clearly. "I think it's time to acknowledge which of us has really made an impact here." Unseen Kurogiri winced and prepared a warp gate as Tomura screamed in rage and lunged at Izuku. He never got the chance to use it. He'd prepared it for the wrong person. Toga was faster. He hadn't seen her move, but the girl had obviously been waiting for her chance. She slid forward, her knife flashing, then blood gushed and the smell of it filled the bar. Tomura screamed again. This time in agony. It took Kurogiri a moment to see why. He was clutching his arm, at the stump. The hand he had extended towards Izuku was on the floor. "You bastard!" Tomura roared. He lashed out at Toga. Again she slid out of his way. That wasn't like her. She wasn't that fast. Kurogiri was too surprised to act as she drew a second knife. Her face was split into a homicidal grin. "You aren't going to touch my little Izuku," she told Tomura. He snarled and lunged again at Izuku. Himiko was faster and she slashed her knife in quickly. There was a soft thump and Tomura's other hand fell to the ground. It was brutal, but Toga was like that. He reeled back, tucking the stump of both arms into his armpits as Himiko moved. She put her knife to his throat, pulling him down to his knees, ignoring the blood. "You bastard," Tomura spat, his eyes fixed on Izuku. Kurogiri could see betrayal in that gaze, but he could also see questions. Tomura was questioning why he wasn't stepping in. Truthfully, Kurogiri didn't know either. "You look so much better covered in blood, Izuku," Toga purred. "Just so long as it's not my blood," Imoku told her gently, taking out a handkerchief and wiping at his face. The blood had managed to splatter over his no doubt very expensive suit. "Ow! Izuku!" Himiko groused, but she appeared happy. Izuku looked at Tomura, who was glaring up at him. He sighed. "I guess it was always going to come to this," he murmured. Kurogiri was reminded of his previous thought. The argument had been building for a while, though he had been naive. It was never going to be between the two of them. It involved the entire league except Himiko had obviously chosen her side. The others weren't sure. They were shifting, but in a way that spoke of their confusion. Except the longer they took to make their decision, the more the decision was made for them. "You don't have the guts to go through with this," Tomura proclaimed. "Oh, I think you will find I do," Izuku said, nodding at Himiko. She wasted no time. One cut, ear to ear. And that was the end of Tomura. Izuku picked up his beer and saluted the bleeding body before he downed the last of the amber liquid. "And that is the end of that," he said when Tomura stilled. Izuku looked around the bar, meeting each of the league members' eyes. He lingered on Dabi, and the fire villain just rolled his eyes before giving the politician a nod. Imoku smirked, before he turned to look at Kurogiri. The bartender sighed. He looked at Izuku, and the body of Tomura. He should feel something more, but he had seen this before. He had seen this all through his career as a villain, but never quite at this level. But then, who would think to even attempt to take out Sensei? This was inevitable as soon as Sensei brought Izuku here. As soon as Izuku and Tomura both had positions of power. Perhaps it was what Sensei wanted. Perhaps this is what Sensei meant when he said that Imoku's path was possibly more important. The man covered every angle, but this was not an angle that could be discussed. And while Tomura had led the league, Izuku had led others to embrace the new reality. They were both leaders and the league could not afford two. No, they'd never really had two leaders. There had always been one, just that he chose to remain hidden. Kirojiri thought back. Izuku had made the suggestions Tomura followed. Izuku had kept Tomura diverted with overhaul, with the news of Hawks. Izuku had controlled everything, and at the point when Tomura thought he had the upper hand, Izuku displayed his. He'd granted Tomura the illusion of victory, had given him that much, but he was right. Now was the time for strength and restraint. Something Tomura didn't have. Sensei covers every angle, Kirojiri told Izuku. That was really the only thing he could say. He hadn't seen this coming, but now that it had, he accepted it. There could never be two leaders of the league, and he no longer doubted Izuku. This was what Sensei wanted. He'd said it himself, Izuku had a different path than Shigaraki, but his path was just as important. It was different until now, when it rejoined. And now it was the most important path. The boy smiled at him. That he does, he agreed. That he does. He accepted another pint of beer and turned back to the league. I meant what I said, he told them firmly, stepping into the role they were used to Tomura occupying. Now is not the time to run wild. Now is the time to simply let events take their course. I will lead you through this change, Izuku promised. And once settled, the league will emerge again, as the only power that matters. Until then, all you have to do is obey me, while I deal with the other loose end, he added ominously. The league members shuddered but nodded. Kirojiri looked the same as always, but his mind was working on the logistics. Imoku would not stay with them. He would remain a representative. But that wasn't too different from Sensei. There was enough time, and he nodded internally. That explained why Dabi was so quick to accept it. He'd probably been offered the acting leadership of the league. That would please him. To the league, Izuku toasted. To the league, the members replied. Dabi drank his beer. Himiko licked her knives and the rest drank what was on hand. Izuku smiled. Sensei was right. It was all about power. And now that he had the power, he could help so many. He'd be their hero. There'd be some losses, there always was. But he could not go back now. To the future, he added the toast. Because now, in a future without heroes, he was free to act. And he would save the world. Lafop, how is that for a hostile takeover? Epilogue, you've got a visitor. The guard's voice was unnecessarily loud. All for One moved his head towards the door. It was all the movement he could get away with. He couldn't see anything. If he tried activating a quirk, then the sensors were too good. Even if the quirk was passive, the sensors were all trained on him. All day, every day. They never rested. He sighed. All Might again? He thought he'd dealt with that one. No, someone else, the guard said, and All for One heard the door open. That was a surprise. No visitor was allowed to actually get close to him. Even those tending to him didn't enter the same room. There were several taps implanted into his body, and those who administered them weren't even in the same cell. The tubes went upwards, into the ceiling. They were above him. Separated. His cell was cleaned by drones. For someone to actually come into his cell. That was interesting. Be polite, the guard warned. I'm always polite, All for One replied as he heard approaching footsteps. That's enough. All for One stiffened imperceptibly. He knew that voice. It had been years since he'd heard it, but he knew it. You can go now. The instruction was soft. All for One smiled. He could hear the power. But the guard objected. It's okay, you can trust me, more. Power laced the tone. All for One heard the guard leave, and the door close. You've gotten good with that, All for One commented. You expected nothing less, came the relaxed reply. He grinned. He had expected nothing less. He had gotten nothing less. So why have you come? Let's call it nostalgia, his guest said. Nostalgia? All for One chuckled. It's as good a reason as any, came the reply. You've gotten far more bold. Necessity. True, and we both know that there won't be a record. He couldn't see, but he could imagine the smug smile his guest gave him. Of course not. I visited the facilities, but I never visited you. All for One nodded. He had taught this one well. And from the smug tone of voice, and their very presence here, he knew that things were going well. Is everything achieved? There's just one outstanding issue, the reply was smooth. Oh? His guest chuckled. You always were so expressive, Sensei. I wonder what people would think if they knew I learnt all my oration skills. From you? You flatter me. Always, Sensei, always. His guest sighed. You know, those years ago, on that roof, I would never have believed the world to be so fragile. It was All for One's turn to laugh. Society is only ever as strong as its foundations. And the foundation was crumbling. He nodded slightly, aware that even if this record would be erased, he was still being monitored, so he couldn't move much. Then I drove a sledgehammer into those foundations. And look where it's gotten you. Oh, I am Sensei. I am. There was a touch of awe in his guest's voice. It reminded him of a child that was full of wonder, a child he had seen only in brief moments. A child who was gone. He got the feeling that his guest had come to some sort of conclusion. I guess I came today to thank you. While I doubt everything has gone quite as you envisaged, you were never one to stick to a plan when something else presented itself. Of course not, All for One agreed. Besides, I left the world to my apprentices when it was time for them to learn on their own. You did. I was upset about it at the time, but I see now. It was for the best. Tomura couldn't have grown with you there. You gave him guidance, and then he took his own path. If you'd been there for longer, he would have been too predictable. And you, All for One said. And me, his guest sighed his agreement. And me, he repeated. Though I still have a ways to go. There are no heroes anymore, and correspondingly, there are no villains. You've done well. You've both done well, All for One praised his guest. Thank you. Though as I said, there is just one outstanding issue. The tone was unexpectedly cold. All for One froze, and then he felt a slight burning from his arm. He jerked. The monitors beeped in warning. You are feeling it now, aren't you? His guest questioned solicitously. All for One grinned. He wasn't sure exactly what it did, but he had a few thoughts. It wouldn't kill him. That would be too obvious, and his guest wouldn't risk that. It would be something else. Something far more subtle. He was the one outstanding issue, but not for long. It made complete sense. To maintain the new status, there could be no risk of the original supervillain returning. Oh, Izuku, my boy, All for One breathed, you never cease to amaze me. Heroes aren't the only ones who are cruel, Izuku said, and All for One heard him move away. All for One recognized that line. He grinned, and then snorted before he laughed and laughed and laughed as something burned through his veins and the door opened to let Izuku out. The future was in good hands, AFO End Part 1.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.